Okay, hopefully we have Dr. Richard Saunders, the librarian, in front of you.
Yes, we do.
Very good. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends, family, brothers and sisters, and those that are pending as brothers and sisters. We welcome you as part of the extended family on the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum this evening to get acquainted with Dr. Richard Saunders, who is a librarian. My experience with librarians is that they are an awesome breed. My mother was one, of course, and the nature of her research abilities were just an amazement. And so, of course, I have appreciated the delightful relationship with numerous reference librarians ever since. He is an academic librarian, the former dean of library services at Southern Utah University. His career in history is centered on preserving the sources of history as a certified archivist and special collections librarian. But he's also researched, written, and published widely in historical topics, including Yellowstone, the West, Mormons, the American popular culture, and the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. He is an advocate for open educational resources, open pedagogy, and higher education. I have found he has written about the Gladenites, and having spoken about the Gladenites in a sermon a couple of weeks ago, I was delighted to find a source that actually helped me out with that one. But Gladden Bishop was one of the early dissenters that established an alternative that Stephen Shields would be proud of. Anyway, the Gladenites went to Salt Lake City to try to convert the Mormons from following polygamy, and did not have a lot of success. But they did get Martin Harris to join, offered at least his witness as a part of the fellowship, and then John Page and Granville Hedrick also joined, and Page and Hedrick were the ones then that proceeded to establish the Temple Lot Church. And so the fact that there's a historical trend that traces through that sequence, and Dr. Saunders has done some of the research behind it to help pull that piece together, is another invitation that we want to extend to him. Although we're already extending and have just booked him for another opportunity in next month to share his massive timeline of the Book of Mormon as it relates to the timelines of the other cultures of what else is going on in the world. Fascinating piece of work, and the kind of thing that only a reference librarian would enjoy. And he says he did it just for fun. Anyway, we welcome Richard Saunders to our forum this evening to address Zion's Printing and Publishing. And let me offer a prayer and we'll proceed to turn it over to him. Let us pray. Composer of all the chapters of life, the books of human genesis, the contextual history and mystery producing man, we bow and recognize appreciation that you create so much beyond us, causing us to reach to apprehend your plan. Waves of light, a sound of water, of history, all so much more than we are able to embrace. Yet they allow us glimpses of your greatness, the vastness of your creation, the smiles upon your face. As we seek to apprehend your nature from our glimpses of all you have composed, we find ourselves in awe, for we see you in our DNA, in our survival, in the James Webb photos of the multiverse disclosed. This evening, we ask your blessing on our forum, and especially on Brother Saunders, our librarian presenter. And we hope to feel your spirit helping us to balance perspectives such that we're able to find your messages to us, whether on the periphery or in the center. And as we consider Gladenites and social issues, printing technology, Mormon history, all kinds of things we rely on, we ask your blessing on our forum, that all participants will feel a little touch of Zion. For as we seek together to learn, to study, to gain the best perspectives we can, we appreciate that you are God. You have given us place in an awesome creation, creating us in your image and calling us man. In the sacred name of Jesus, we pray. Amen. Let me get out of the share screen, and I think the floor is open for Richard Saunders to share with us. Welcome to the Book of Mormon Perspectives Forum.
I will. Am I unmuted now? I got it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, then, thank you very much for inviting me. I hope I say something reasonably intelligent tonight. It might be a little strange, partly because I'm talking through part of another book that came out earlier this spring, and partly because I speak a different language, a slightly different language. I speak printer, and that's really what I'm going to focus on tonight, is printing and printing and publishing. So I'm going to share my screen and get things started. What you can see there is just an image of the book itself. This came out in January. Is it very narrow? Yeah, I think this has got to be one of the narrowest scholarly subjects I think I've ever seen. I'm studying a single edition of a single book, partly because I just wanted to, partly because as somebody who used to work in publishing and printing, it interested me and it caught my attention, and kind of it's taken on a bit of a life of its own. But today I am going to work with a little bit different topic. I'm going to take some out of the middle of that and talk about LDS printing, Latter-day Saint publishing of the Book of Mormon in Independence, Missouri, because it's a little strange and a little odd and not what people have expected most of the time to make it work on. I'm going to focus more on the Book of Mormon than the Book of Mormon itself. It's going to be a little different, but I think it'll be fun. So let's jump in and see what we can do with this. A little bit of background to start with, and that is, first, you have to understand, or we have to understand, that there are basically three printing processes, and they're all known by different things. There are three genuine technologies. They all do the same thing, but they do it in very different ways. The one on the left that says A is a letterpress, and that's where relief printing, sometimes it's called. And relief printing has a raised surface, and you put ink across the top and you squeeze it together, and that produces a page image, or an image of type. The second type is actually an older form, or a different form of printing. That's called intaglio, and that's either done by cutting a groove with a burin or by etching using acid usually. But that creates a lowered surface, and then you put ink on the top of the plate and you scrape it off so that it doesn't print in places where the line isn't. And then the line is sticky ink, and it goes up against the image, and it produces an image, or it goes up against the paper and produces an image. And that kind of printing is still used very much for fine illustrations. Albrecht Dürer, who you remember him, the medieval printer, did some stunning images both in intaglio printing and in letterpress. The third kind is called planographic printing, and that's where you use a perfectly flat stone, sometimes now zinc plates, called a zincograph sometimes. And that's where you use a waxy crayon and you put a surface on there, get rid of the stuff that isn't wax, then put water on top, and then you use an oily ink, and the oil and water don't mix, so the ink doesn't stay on the surface of the stone, only where the crayon is or where the wax is, and then it creates an impression that way. So three different types. What I'm talking about tonight is traditional letterpress printing, and that's printed for a very, very long way. In fact, you'll remember that the original Book of Mormon, the 1830 edition, is printed in letterpress in New York. And the way you do that, people tend to forget that it's not just one image that you're printing. You're actually printing dozens, usually hundreds of small pieces of metal type that have to be put on themselves into a line. So normally what will happen is you'll get an image like this, and this is a double case. This is called a news and book font. And when we think about printing, or we think about letters, and you and I went through school and they talked about uppercase letters and lowercase letters, this is why. Because they literally came from at the uppercase or the lowercase, depending on where they were set, what type of letter they were. So in a news and book font, the kind that Egbert Grandin would have used, you can see that anything that wasn't italic or bold, which would have come from different fonts, would have come out of one of these two cases. So small caps, all, capital letters, and then of course all your small ones and your spaces as well. So it was a challenge, and I didn't have any pictures of a stick on how you get this thing all together, but basically in order to print a book, in order to set up the Book of Mormon, an account written by the hand of Mormon, each time there was a letter involved there, your hand had to go to the case and pull it out and put it in line. And obviously, if that's going to happen, somebody's going to make a mistake someplace. And then because the type had to go back in line, had to go back into those cases before you could pick it out again to set more pages. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But this is where the Book of Mormon comes from. This is the tradition that comes out of. And for the first, 20 or 30 editions, this is the only way you could set type. It was the only fashion that you could get words in a line so that you could get them printed. So all the way back from Gutenberg, that's the way they did it. The first movable type is invented by the Koreans, as a matter of fact, in about the mid 13th century. The earliest dated book we can tell was printed from movable type and is dated is 1377 in Korea. Now, Johann Gutenberg reinvents his own version of type and creates the printing press and printer's ink, all of which had to be done at the same time. And he produces the first printed work in Europe. But the Koreans had a jump on us by about 100 years, 120 years or so. So anyway, that's how books are set at the time. And I'm dealing with something that's a little bit different. I'm talking about just the Book of Mormon. And there's lots of other things that need to be talked about, but I'm going to kind of focus on Latter-day Saint publishing, and specifically Book of Mormon publishing, because there's some interesting things that happen. When you're looking at the Book of Mormon in terms of publishing, by 1870, the Book of Mormon is out of copyright. Joseph Smith's author and proprietor copyright that he said he registered is no longer in force. And so by 1869, anybody can print the Book of Mormon, at least the text. So the Latter-day Saints are not the only ones who are doing it. There's at least one commercial edition, two commercial editions that are produced in the late 1850s. And of course, the reorganization publishes the Book of Mormon, and the Latter-day Saints are publishing in Britain chiefly as well. By the time of the 20th century, Latter-day Saint publishing of the Book of Mormon is not the same as you would have expected. It's not a church function. And that's really kind of interesting. Orson Pratt, well, it's very decentralized. Anybody who needs a copy, who feels they needs a copy, can generate a copy of the book themselves, and they do. They tended to be done when they were necessary rather than on any sort of fixed schedule, which is a little different. Most of it also was not done in Utah, because Utah simply didn't have publishing capacity, large book publishing capacity, and they didn't really have a binding capacity until after the railroad in the late 1860s. And even by then, they're not really well developed. And by that point, places like Chicago, Kansas City, Nashville, as a matter of fact, Boston and New York had really taken over publishing in the United States. So it was cheaper and easier to simply let somebody do it further abroad. And that's what they ended up doing. A guy by the name of Orson Pratt, who you remember from the first members, one of the early members of the Quorum of the 12, who goes west, is given an assignment to put together a versification of the Book of Mormon after the reorganization publishes its first Book of Mormon with verses in place. That's 1874. Pratt gets the assignment in 1875, spends all of 1876 and 1877 doing his versification. And then the book is published in 1879 with the first LDS edition. So the reorganization, the Community of Christ's versing, and the LDS version are not the same. They're done differently. The LDS edition ignores the chapter and the paragraph structure that the reorganization, the early reorganization, had been very careful to maintain. And then that gets done later again as well. So how does that lead to independence? Well, it does, partly because of these two gentlemen right here. In 1905, a couple of mission presidents, LDS mission presidents. On the one hand, there is German Ellsworth, and he's the young man sitting in the front of these two. German Ellsworth has the idea that it's just not cost effective. It would be better cost effective if they could centralize pamphlet publication and in the hands of the missions rather than contract that out to non-Latter-day Saint publishers and printers all over the country. And so in 1905, he successfully founds a private concern for doing church publishing called Zion's Printing and Publishing Company. And they call it Zion's because it's eventually set up in Independence, Missouri, and for a couple of reasons. I don't have time to go deeply into that, but it was part of the redemption of Zion effort. The Latter-day Saints in Utah, being rather culturally insular, kind of ignored the reorganization and didn't consider them part of the church at that point. But even so, they were determined to come back and reinstall some sort of a Latter-day Saint presence in Independence. And what happened was that the United States mission presidents banded together, agreed that they would centralize publishing for missionary pamphlets and missionary issues that were useful, and that they would run it themselves. Well, that gets set up just down the street from the brand new auditorium, or the auditorium that's under construction. This is one of the Sanborn maps for Independence in, I think this one's 1916, so it had been put up by that point. And right here on the corner of Walnut and Pleasant, which you may remember is directly east of the auditorium. It's as far east on the original 80-acre plot or 70-acre plot. So it was there. Today it's let's see, it's across the street from the Overfelt Johnston House, a historic home, and it's directly east of where the current Latter-day Saint building is situated there. Walnut Street hasn't moved, Pleasant Street hasn't moved, but you can see that. The church eventually loaned that Zion's Printing and Publishing about $7,500 to establish their own printing in a rented building. And then a little bit later, they built this, let's see, it's there already. No, it's there. They built a square building behind there, and that's where they established a print shop. It was about 80 feet square, and it had a whole bunch of things packed inside of it. But that's where they conducted Zion's Printing and Publishing, beginning in about 1915. It primarily published missionary pamphlets, missionary tracts, but eventually they began being interested in publishing the Book of Mormon. Now, Hiram Smith's grandson, Joseph Fielding Smith, he was an apostle. I know that he sends a marked copy of the Book of Mormon to Independence, to Samuel Benyon, and says, here's the corrected version. And you don't send corrected books to any place unless you're going to use it for printer's copy. And that was what was happening. The Zion's Printing and Publishing decided they were going to publish an edition of the Book of Mormon. They began issuing their own copy in what I know is in March of 1916. I've seen a certificate that says this is one of the first copies of the book published in Independence, is March of 1916. In 1917, they build this print shop behind the church building that was there on the corner, and they buy a set of their own printing presses. If you're really interested, it's an old Kelly B press. That's something that's probably too much. And then they eventually take the plates of the original Book of Mormon that somebody else had typeset, and they begin issuing the Independence edition of the Book of Mormon in editions 3, 4, and 5. And they're actually stated on the cover or on the interior: second Independence edition, third Independence edition, fourth Independence edition, on their own presses. And then there's a complication. And this is really where I kind of came into the picture as far as my own interest as a printing historian. There's this thing that shows up. This looks like a garden variety Book of Mormon, but it isn't. In fact, it's basically a blank book, all except for a few pages like this that show up. And if you look carefully at your screen, you'll notice there's an interesting thing. This is the Book of Jacob, but on the left-hand page, on the verso page, it's page 136. On the recto page, the right-hand page, it's 139. Now, I suspect all of us have been reading long enough to know that you don't just skip a bunch of pages and go from one page to another. But that's what happened. In fact, no pages back up in this book, and most of the sheets in it are simply blank. There's nothing in them at all. And that's a problem. Now, I also noticed when I started looking at this thing that the line breaks and the page breaks were different than any copy of the Independence Book of Mormon that I could get my hands on. So if that's all different and the number of lines on the page is also different, something has happened, and that's what I finally figured out, and that's what got me interested. I figured out that what they were really interested in is the type, not the book itself, but the type. So they were apparently looking at resetting the Book of Mormon in probably 1917, maybe 1918. Can't tell exactly because it's not dated. And that they were looking to save page space to tuck in the back a study guide to the Book of Mormon that had been published by or was being written by somebody else. And I'm not exactly sure who it is. The only name we have is Morton. And I think I know who it is, and I explore it more in my book, but it was a strange puzzle. And I knew that there was something up that was odd, and I knew that it had to fit in here because of this little bit of detail. If you notice, the fifth Independence edition is on the left. The sixth Independence edition is on the right. And I need to point out that for a printing historian, for somebody who really deals with the weird stuff of printing, any sort of typographical difference suggests, well, it is evidence that the book has been reset. And on this page and these 2 pages alone, there's 3 bits of evidence. One of them is right here. You can tell that the Book of Mormon, the title, is not in the same type font. The 6th Independence edition is a little narrower. It's a little, and the 5th Independence is a little rounder. You can also tell by the space in between the lines. The words and the typesetting themselves is exactly the same, but there's extra space between the lines. The third part is down here at the bottom of the page. On the 5th Independence on the left, they've used caps, small caps, and on the 6th Independence on the right side, you've got all capital letters. So, ta-da, there you go. My suspicion is that Zion's Printing and Publishing had decided to reset the Book of Mormon entirely. But the odd thing is, they didn't use the type or the book that they had used with this type dummy that they had worked up. And there's an explanation why, and it involves Bibles and a number of other things that are kind of part of the book of mine that may not be as interesting for most folks these days. But anyway, it's clear that they're doing some different things. So what's going on? Well, it's a challenge. I'm gonna stop this share for just a second. Okay, so what's going on? Well, what's happening is that the First Presidency in Salt Lake City is a little concerned because they have located a couple of typographic errors in the Book of Mormon. Now they're very, very minor. There's two transposed words. So it says of the or the of or something like that. It's very, very minor. But they were very, very intent on having a textually perfect book. And so they were starting to look around in 1917, 1918 to figure out how can we improve this? And as I started noticing, well, let me put it this way. By 1920, there had been enough concern that the First Presidency decides simply, in the Quorum of the 12, decide to produce a new edition of the Book of Mormon. And they go through a long textual review and some textual comparisons. They generate new notes. They create some new study aids or guides, and they put a chronology into it. And if you're really, really interested in Latter-day Saint book publishing in the mid-20th century, early 20th century, then I'll refer you to the book and let you deal with the details there. However, this was also my interest in the ways to talk about how printing itself had changed. And it really was, it's an interesting story. It's a technological story, and it's a fun thing. But the most important reason I decided to pursue it is because I found some differences in the book, in the later Book of Mormon, that I couldn't explain. And so when I got into stirring around and trying to figure out what the puzzle, which versions come first, which books come first, how do they date, that's where I started getting interesting. And so I wrote the book basically to explain what I found. And Independence figures back in the book, or figures back in the story again. So you would expect to have variation and differences and errors and all kinds of things when you're dealing with this kind of technology, when you're having to do absolutely everything by hand. But you expect it much less when it's this kind of technology, when it's produced by a machine that is absolutely remarkable and is used by the 1920s, is used almost everywhere across the country. In fact, almost around the world. This is a linotype machine, and if you want to be really picky, it's a Model 4, but that's just for what it's worth. And this is the guy that's standing on the right is holding a magazine. Now, part of the problem when you have this kind of typesetting is you have to have literally tens of thousands of pieces, each with a single letter. And it's remarkably heavy. A single news and book font in a proper font like Egbert Grandin may have used in 1829, 1830, as he's typesetting the Book of Mormon, would have weighed around 3/4 of a ton. Now, that's a lot of money when you're looking at every single letter has to be individually cast by hand. So it's a major investment. By the 1920s, thankfully, a guy by the name of Ottmar Mergenthaler had invented the linotype machine, and it worked on a magazine that had small brass pieces in it that fell into place in order, and you can see the keyboard. They were keyed. It would open up the magazine, drop one of those things directly in, just simply using gravity, and then it would line them up, and that's why they call it a linotype. It worked not by having just a bunch of them. You'd have to usually a bunch of these. In fact, these are the machines probably that set the Book of Mormon that I will talk a little bit later about. These are intertype machines, and they're a little different than a linotype, but they work the same way. So each one of these little things show up on this brass magazine, brass piece, and you can see that they're cast upside down and reading left to right. So this is exactly the way that a line of type or a linotype would have looked like if it was inside the machine, ready to be cast. And then a casting head pushes against the side of that block, and it pushes molten type metal in place and creates a line of type. Okay. This is the way that type was set from roughly 1884. It was very, very well adopted by the 1890s, clear up until the mid and late, actually the late 1970s. This is the way every book, every newspaper was set all the way across the country, including the Book of Mormon. And then once those individual rows of type were cast that represented a single line of a book, then they would be lined up in a plate in long rows, and that would be your text. And that's how the thing worked. Now, I got interested in it because once you do this, once all the errors are corrected, nothing can change because it's fixed in metal. And it gets even more complicated because by the 1920 edition of the Latter-day Saint Book of Mormon, they've actually moved to a new technology called electrotyping. And an electrotype, if here looking at on the left, this is a copper negative that's produced from this type. It's basically a mask. So they pour latex over the face of the type, and it creates a negative of the type. Actually, it's a positive, but they create a positive negative. And then they put it into a bath of chemicals, and it creates this of copper, and it transfers to the surface of the copper of the latex mask, and it produces. Now, the good thing is once you've got that latex mask, you can make any number of copies of the book. So rather than just running a big book like, say, the Sears catalog on a single printing press, they could make 10 copies of the plates, run them on 10 printing presses, and burn millions of copies of, say, of the Sears catalog in a very short amount of time. Then that plate, if you look here on the one that says FPO, this is an image that I couldn't find. I got out of another book, but it shows the press bed and putting a printing plate in place so that you could create on a flat sheet of paper what has to be folded up in order to make it work. Let me get through here and get caught up. Now, this FPO image introduces us to the complication of the Book of Mormon called an imposition. Because if you look at a piece of paper, if this represents a sheet of paper that's going into the printing press, it makes a difference whether you fold this sheet this way or this way to line up the pages. And since every paper is folded at least 3 times in order to get something that would work, you can see that the order of the plates going in the paper into the printing press makes a huge difference. And so one of the things that I do as a print historian is to look at this kind of imposition and decide how books are actually produced. And that's where things started getting interesting. Because what I discovered was, at least in case of the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon, there's a problem. So the 1920 edition was first produced octavo. That means there are 8 pages that are put together. And if you look at this image, this is an imposition that shows an octavo imposition. The blue and the gray are different sides of the same sheet. If you were to have them go, they would fold, they would back up this direction. And you can, what would happen is that this press sheet was cut in half, and then each of those two sides were folded. Now that's important because that means in an octavo imposition, number one, or the lowest numbered page, always goes down into the press and closest against the platen. That's just standard practice. So no one ever gets confused. So on an octavo, you can see that page one would back up against page two, but in order to, once you folded it up to get it in the right place, page three has to be on the same imposed form as page two. This is an octavo imposition. But I discovered that there's something fishy going on, something rotten in Denmark, because what it turns out that there were two printings of the Book of Mormon using exactly the same plates. But this is a 16 mo, or a sextodecimo if you want to get really technical. Number one is still in the same position. You can see that down there. But look at where number 17 is. Is it in the same place? It's not, is it? In fact, there aren't, other than page one, that's the only one of the pages that ends up in the same place. So when they printed the Book of Mormon, they printed what they called a library edition, bound differently. And then they printed the missionary edition of the Book of Mormon. They were run with the same plates, but two different times. You have two different printings. So what had happened is that the printing for the 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon had been contracted to an extraordinarily large publisher and very, very quick, called Conkey Publishing, Hammond, Indiana, upstate, right in the very corner of Indiana, right between Gary and Chicago. And Conkey was well known. It was very, very fast. It printed the Sears catalog for the Sears and Roebuck Company, but it was said without a shred of boasting that once the plates for a book had been given to the Conkey Company, this company was so big and so modern, it could deliver 10,000 printed, collated, and bound copies of a book to the publisher 24 hours after they had the plates. So they could operate very, very, very quickly. And that's where the Mormons went to get their book done. When they printed the Book of Mormon in the 1920 edition, this is what it looked like. Now you can see that it actually said 1920 on the base of the title page in the imprint. And the two printings of the book were bound in different ways. It was released in December of 1920. There were several different editions. The one that's on the left is the blue copy. That's the library copy. And then there was two different versions bound in a fabric called fabricoid that looked like leather. It wasn't leather. And then there was a leather edition of the book that was done as well. And then on the far right, you can see the missionary edition of the book, and that's the one that was printed 16 mo. The fun thing was that they redesigned the book entirely. This is what the missionary edition of the book looked like in 1920. Now, that's in Indiana. What does that have to do with independence? Well, what happened was I discovered that producing a new copy of the Book of Mormon, a new version of the Book of Mormon, really upset the business arrangements. So all the companies that had produced the Book of Mormon in Kansas City and in Chicago ended up losing the contract to produce the book. And there was only this new official version of the Book of Mormon that was being issued to the Latter-day Saints. Well, that meant that Zion's Printing and Publishing Company lost the ability to produce one of the few things that it actually made a little bit of money on to sustain itself. There wasn't a big market in Latter-day Saint missionary pamphlets. So losing the Book of Mormon was a real problem. But at the same time, The other publisher of the Book of Mormon also lost the ability to produce the Book of Mormon, and that was the Deseret News Press in Salt Lake City. So somebody made a determination that it was kind of strange for a non-Latter-day Saint company to be publishing a book that was intended for missionary work when the Saints' own missionary publisher couldn't publish it. So they got together, and there was a decision made that the Zion's Printing and Publishing, which was producing mostly pamphlets, but also a few other things, some children's books and a cookbook and some other things, they would have the ability to print the missionary edition of the Book of Mormon. And in 1927, they began publishing the Book of Mormon again, but only the missionary edition. Now, this is important for a couple of reasons. This gives you a little bit of a cue of what I would look for. This is called the two-line edition. And you can see that in the top right side, it says the Press of Zion's Printing and Publishing Company, and it identifies them as a printer's mark. And it also, on the back of the title page, it actually stated that this was the edition of September 1927. And then I'll point you to the other book in just a second. The binding changed, and I found it fairly interesting because the binding was not the same that had been published in 1924 by the Conkey Company, the last time that they put it out. For several years, Zion's Printing and Publishing issued a Book of Mormon, mostly for missionaries. And the last dated one was this edition. In fact, they actually changed the printer's mark to say Press of Zion's Publishing again. And on the back of the title page in the lower left-hand corner, you can see there is October 1931. That's the last dated edition of the Book of Mormon. What was happening in 1931? Does anybody remember? Why might publishing or printing change after that date? What had happened in October of 1929?
Depression.
The Depression hits. By 1931, they're into some pretty desperate circumstances. People aren't buying copies of the Book of Mormon to give out much unless they can do it. So Zion's Printing, after 1931, decides to take all markings, all dates out of the book that identified the various printings that they had done. And between 1932 and whenever they stopped printing the book, they simply ran the same plates over and over and over again without any identifying dates. Let's see. And they ended up doing this. Now that changes just a little bit. You can see that the press doesn't change, or the printer's mark doesn't change, but the binding changed. By this point, this character, this is Samuel Benyon. He is still running the press and actually holds it up through about 1933. After that, he's called back to Salt Lake as another responsibility. And between 1932, 1933, and 1947, the book is published and run just without a mark in it, which was kind of interesting. It was issued up until about 1948. Benyon continued as the mission president and the director directing the printer. He's a print manager as well, up until 1933. He's called back to Salt Lake. And then after about 1947, there's a request made by the presiding bishop's office for Zion's Printing and Publishing. He says, give me an inventory. Tell us what you've got on the floor. There was something interesting that happened there that provides a clue. And I want you to notice something that was interesting about this. And I'm hoping you can see on this. This is part of the printing inventory, and it has the printing machinery on it. It has all the equipment that they've got in the shop. What do you notice about this list of material and what you know based on book publishing? And you can unmute yourself and talk, because there's something interesting here that happens. What do we see?
You got
Anybody notice it?
$45,000 on paper and bundles and $25,000 on machinery.
Right. And much of what they have is just unsold missionary pamphlets. You don't see the rest of it there. This is just kind of the bottom of the third page where they had listed the type. So there's a bunch of machinery. What's missing from the machinery that's needed to produce books? Anybody catch it?
Ink.
Okay, you can, the first 5 items are all printing presses. Okay, so me as a printing geek, I can tell you exactly what kind of presses they have. They have 2 linotype machines. Doesn't say what kind, but they're pretty good ones. There's a Dexter folding machine, and that's one where you can put in a sheet and it very quickly folds things very, very quickly. So you'd be using that to fold sheets for pamphlets. There are 2 folding machines. There's a punch machine. The punch is for drilling holes for loose leaf bindings, okay, for reports. There's a perforator.
One cutter.
One cutter. Yep, just one cutter.
They have no binding machine.
Bingo, that's it.
That was what I was going to say.
You are exactly correct. And this was a revelation. I had no idea. Everybody over here in Utah has assumed that Zion's Printing and Publishing had been a full service operation. They weren't. They were only a printer. And they must have contracted the printing or the binding to somebody else. And it probably wasn't themselves. So I took a look, actually asked an acquaintance to check in the Independence, Kansas City directories and see who would have been doing their binding. It was very likely done locally, although they could very well have contracted it any place across the United States. But it was a revelation that nobody at Zion's Printing was doing their own work. And for a long time, you know, they'd done this for 20 years or more, but they weren't binding their own material. So that's kind of the odd story of Zion's Printing and the Book of Mormon specifically. What happens is that the reason that the presiding bishop's office asks for an inventory of their stock is because the Book of Mormon is running out of copyright from the 1920 edition. There's a 27-year wall on the Book of Mormon on any sort of work. And they had come up against in 1947. And so the presiding bishop's office asks them for the inventory because they're going to make a major change. And they end up deciding to completely reset the Book of Mormon another time. It's done in Cambridge, Massachusetts by University Press, Inc., not Cambridge University Press. Zion's Printing and Publishing basically continues as a pamphlet and book printer until about 1951. And then in 1951, they close shop entirely. The LDS Church determines they're going to consolidate printing operations in Salt Lake City with the Deseret News Press. And that's the printing concern that attracts a young veteran by the name of Thomas Monson, who in a few years later becomes an apostle and several years later becomes the president of the LDS Church after the death of Gordon Hinckley. So that's kind of it. A little bit of technology, a little bit Book of Mormon, and a lot of puzzle doing on my part. It's kind of hard to tell only part of the story without talking about all the ins and outs of the crazy things that are done. But that's the story of the Book of Mormon, the LDS Book of Mormon in a very RLDS town. So let me answer any questions you might have. And I can talk about paper and all kinds of other weird things if you're really interested.
Well, I'm really interested, and I very much thank you for this presentation because I think probably few of us knew anything about it. It's just so intriguing that there are so many different editions. I'm particularly intrigued because I've been digging at Nauvoo on the corner of Bain and Water on the site where the 1840 Book of Mormon was published.
Mm-hmm.
Finding the little bits of print there. But then as I do the research, I find that Don Carlos went to Cincinnati and had the book stereotyped.
Right. It was never typeset in Nauvoo. It was only typeset in Cincinnati. And stereotype is a little bit different. They make a paper mask of that, basically paper mache. And that is solid enough that they can take it off the type and pour lead over the top of it, and then plane the surface flat and then pin that to a board. It's a different type of replication, but you can still make an infinite number, well, almost infinite number of stereo plates from that. It's not as good as electrotype, but it's very serviceable.
Would they have been able to take the stereotype plates to Nauvoo and print there?
Yes, that's exactly what they did.
And then
So
they
it
also,
was typeset in Cincinnati and then printed in Nauvoo, probably bound in Nauvoo as well, but not for certain.
but we find that they also had a foundry and were type.
Yeah, and they eventually bought their own stereotype foundry and did that work there. But the first edition of the first book of the 1840 Book of Mormon was typeset in Cincinnati. Edward, you have your hand up.
I do.
Go ahead.
One of the things I find really amazing is once the type was set, the reusing of the same setting over and over.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Book of Mormon itself is a remarkable document that requires constant study and reformatting to display the Hebrew character of the book. And by using the same line typing, that incredible feature of the book is effectively masked. But I can see why. The other thing I noticed, which is what I noticed when, let me just say, you may not know this, I reformatted the Book of Mormon into a form of Hebrew poetry. And we also reversified it and renumbered in many places. And tried to add more white space to the pages because, quite frankly, my take on what was going on with the Book of Mormon is that people would read a couple of pages and then their eyes would glaze over.
Yes.
It was packed from top to bottom and side to side. And it was almost as if there had been a conscious decision made that the paper is just too expensive. We're going to have to jam as much as we can on every page. But
well, you're right. You're right. And the reason for that was that they wanted cheap books. They wanted to be able to give them away without a lot of expense.
Yes, I understand. But here's the problem. You can give away cheap books, but if nobody reads them, they're worse than cheap.
You're right. And the one thing that happens in the 1920 edition specifically is they moved to a double column, because a shorter column, a narrower column, is easier on your eye to read. You don't have to track clear back across the page when you're going to a line end. So you can read more quickly.
Well, it turns out that if you write the book, if you format the Book of Mormon in a style that mimics the New King James Bible version, you replicate the poetic structure of the book, and it's actually easier to read.
Yep.
And I was just opened up and looked at this Book of Mormon, the earlier text by Royal
Skousen. Skousen.
Skousen. Wish I could remember that. He has repackaged or reformatted the Book of Mormon in his work, in which he has separated out not paragraphs, but what the biblical scholars call strophes.
Yeah.
And it makes it so much easier to read. So I can see that restrictions placed upon the publication of the book in terms of making it cheap, getting all the information on the page, but making it really difficult.
Yep. You're right. And there's various reasons to have a scriptural text in different forms. And in this case, they were looking for a missionary tool. That's what they were really looking for. So, but you're right. John, you've got your hand up.
Yeah,
John Mueller.
yes. When I moved to Independence, Missouri in 1973, there was an old publishing house right up practically on the Temple lot called Monte Parker Printer. I'm wondering if any of the old equipment from the Zion's Printing and Publishing ended up with those folks.
Quite possibly. It's a kind of a sad story for those of us who are book nerds. Gene Adams, who really is the expert on Zion's Printing and Publishing, he told me that basically once the place closed, they got rid of the equipment and they literally bulldozed the whole thing. They didn't even empty the building. They simply bulldozed it, loaded into trucks, and dumped everything. So they didn't even clean out the building. I would be willing to bet if there was a nearby printer, there's a good chance that they would have acquired the equipment. However, printing equipment is one of those things that is marketed and sold everywhere. And so it could have wound up in Maine or in California just as easily as across the street. That's just the nature of printing equipment. By the way, anybody want to know, W.W. Phelps Press from Independence that was thrown out the window of the print shop in 1833, later ends up in Colorado and was one of the first printing presses there that produced, and then went to New Mexico from there. I mean, it's a fascinating story. Okay, Rick.
Okay, thanks, Richard, for that presentation. I didn't know. I really enjoyed the history of how the evolution of how things got better.
Mm-hmm.
That was fascinating. So in your very first example of your drawing of the raised surface that was wood grained.
Mm-hmm. Usually, well, it can be wood, it can be metal, cast metal too.
Yeah.
Most of it is. It's not my drawing. It's one I picked up from a type manual in the 1930s.
Okay. So at one point they made the whole thing with wood, according to the.
It could have
that.
been. It could have.
Yeah.
Back in Gutenberg's time, they were before they were moving individual letters. They actually did what's called a block book, where you take a square of wood the size of your page and cut it out manually.
Oh man.
Oh yeah, it was really something. And then that didn't go as well as they had hoped. And so Gutenberg comes up with the idea, well, if we reduce that to just a single letter, then you can reuse letters and put them in different places.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And that was before the X-Acto knife.
That was, a matter of fact, before the X-Acto knife. It was remarkable what they would have had to do.
Yeah.
And that's why it took him 10 years and bankrupted him, basically.
Okay. I have a question about the versification of the two versions. If you have an answer, that's great. If you don't, that's okay.
Okay.
Between the RLDS and the LDS, which came first, which came second?
Very brief history. The book was divided up into paragraphs by John Gilbert in the original edition of 1830. He divided it very roughly. He just kind of did it on the fly. Some of the chapters were, some of the chapters were in the manuscript, but Gilbert was the one that divided into paragraphs. 1852.
But there was no numbering, was there?
No,
was there? No.
There was no numbering.
Okay.
In 1852, the British edition numbered the British LDS edition numbered the paragraphs. And that didn't get very much traction. It didn't go over well. The reorganization, the Lamoni printing office put together the first honest to goodness versification and published it in 1874. 1876, I'm sure that a copy made its way to Salt Lake City. Orson Pratt is given the responsibility in 1875, 76 to create a verse structure. And the LDS version is closer to the way that the Bible is divided than the way the Book of Mormon was divided by the RLDS. They looked for, individual sentences. They rebroke the chapters to make sense for reading and for narrative. And Pratt did all of that strictly on his own, but it stuck. It was followed it's been followed ever since. 1879, that book is printed, and then that structure is held through. What really changes in 1920 is that they go from a single wide column on the page to a double column, which most Bibles are anyway. And if you go right back to the very beginning, the King James is printed in a double column as well in 1613.
Okay, so in 1852, the British LDS numbered paragraphs.
Yep.
And 1874, the RLDS and Lamoni were first to put chapters and verses onto it.
Right.
And then 1875, Orson Pratt was given the responsibility to do something with the verse structure, and he
makes it up entirely.
You gave a date, 1876.
That's when he's doing his work.
Oh, okay. So he gets the job in 1875. He's working.
Roughly, yeah. And actually, his copy of the Book of Mormon that he uses for verses is still extant. The Church History Library in Salt Lake still has it.
Is it chapter and verse, or is it a blank one?
It's a standard British edition. I can't remember which printing it is. And
So
then he
it's-
just makes notes in the margin, to break here and to add this verse number there.
Okay. So when they numbered the paragraphs, that when you finally got to the end of Moroni, you'd have a huge number of paragraphs.
They numbered them over for each book. So Alma
okay.
chapter 1, paragraph 1, paragraph 2.
Okay. Well, so at the end of Alma, you'd have a high number.
You would have a
paragraphs.
lot, yes.
Okay, that's interesting. At least they had a natural, maybe a break, depending on how the paragraph was. And the paragraphs were taken from the manuscript?
No, not necessarily. John Gilbert put some of the paragraphs together. And
Okay,
there were some that were in the manuscript, but mostly Gilbert's work.
okay. So
Okay,
we had
Paul,
to look at,
before I
Yeah.
go back to Edward, let me have Paul give a crack at it.
I wanted to just simply insert that the Lamoni was not founded until 1879. So I think we're talking about the Plano edition.
Plano, you're right. Sorry. That's
And then the Herald House did move to Lamoni, I think 1880.
yeah.
Most of the publications would have been Lamoni.
Yeah, it would have been Lamoni. You're right. For Plano. Okay, Frank Fry, if he's still there. I saw him get up. I think he may have gone.
I'll go back to Ed then.
Yeah, Ed?
I was really interested in your remark about the first real printing press coming from the Korean.
Yes.
100
Well, not the
years-
printing press, just movable type.
Okay, yeah, okay, and that predated, I think you said the Gutenberg press.
Yeah, by about 80 years.
And my understanding is the Gutenberg press was famous in the beginning for its publication of the book,
The Bible. Yep.
the Bible.
Yeah.
What was the Korean movable type press type thing, or what were they printing?
Mostly Buddhist scripture.
Okay, so
It was developed in the 13th century. It gets the earliest book we know that we can actually date is 1377. That's the Jikji. And that's a book of Buddhist scripture. They were probably printing and experimenting before that, but the way they did it was different. They had a wooden tray with lines that divided things because, it vertically, it was read vertically.
Right.
And then rather than a printing press, they would simply lay a sheet of paper over the top and polish it off with a batten, which actually the Japanese are still doing that for prints, for woodblock prints today. So that technology hasn't changed in 700 years.
Still impressive.
Oh, very impressive. When I was in China, I went to a library in where was it? It was in Xi'an, and they had I have held a Gutenberg Bible myself, and it was just ooh and ah all over it. But they had a book that was printed 500 years before the Gutenberg in Chinese. I mean, it just blew my mind completely, and it was on paper too. Okay, Frank, let me have you have a turn.
Yes, I think I heard you say that the chapters were placed later in the Book of Mormon. I'm holding an edition of the 1830 that's been reproduced, but
Right.
it's got all of the chapters in there that the RLDS preserved.
Yes, they
and
were
so
more careful with it.
they kept all of the original chapters, but there was no versification in it until later. And
Right.
I think the RLDS experimented several times with the versification, because from the date that you mentioned, I've seen at least one other edition that had verses in it before the 1908. I've got a copy of the 1907, and it's got totally different verses in it.
It does. They reversed the book, not reversed, but they reversified the
Right.
structure
Right.
in 1908. And I didn't mention that, but you're absolutely right. The one from the verse structure from 1874 to 1907 is different from 1908 to the present.
Right.
Well, there was two editions apparently.
Probably, yeah.
Before the 1908, because in the 1907, I think it was kind of an experimental versification, because there was one before that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And verse structure is purely for reading. It's not a textual thing.
Right.
It's intended specifically for study, which is why the King James Version had chapters and verses in it as well.
Well, I've noticed that the verses that are longer, a person tends to get lost in them. The verses that are shorter are easier to read
And remember.
That's right. And the RLDS has like 8,500 some verses, and the LDS has 6,000 some verses. So the RLDS or the LDS versions, some of them take up almost half a page in their double column, and you just get lost in it.
Yeah, and that's especially true in the Doctrine and Covenants. It's
why I prefer
less common.
Yeah, shorter verses, and then when you start putting it in a poetic format like Ed was talking about, where you don't have the block text, you have space. I learned very early on as a teacher that you don't make a test for young people to save paper. I was told that by my principal.
Yep, that's
my first year
absolutely
of
true.
teaching. You got to have space in order to get comprehension and retention.
Right.
And it really does make a difference. So I'm sure you've seen the RCE edition of the Book of Mormon, the Restored Covenant edition.
I have not seen that one myself.
Really?
There are lots and lots and lots of editions of the Book of Mormon out there. A friend of mine, one of the reasons I wrote this book, a friend of mine has made a collection of every English language printing, not edition, but printing of the Book of Mormon. And he's got it, but I just focused right this point on the 1920 edition.
Brother Skousen out there in Utah produced this the earliest edition version, and I've got
Yes.
a copy of that. It's very easy to read.
Yeah.
It's similar to the RCE edition that was printed here in Independence.
Well, Skousen, I actually helped Skousen as a librarian years ago when he was working on the initial project. What Skousen's work was looking for was the earliest textual version. So
Right.
depending on which
Yeah.
version you were looking at of his work,
Right.
it's either the line by line of the manuscript that he was
Mhm.
looking to identify, so he could see how it's written out as well as the text by itself.
Well,
But
what
yeah.
he found out and what I discovered when I was in Kenya working on a translation into Swahili is that the lines that as they're broken are he calls them sense lines, I believe.
Mhm.
And while I was over there, I hadn't seen Skousen's edition yet, but I discovered the same thing. And I gave him a name and I wrote it down. I can't remember it now, but it's something like sense lines also.
Mhm.
And each line has a specific idea in it.
Right.
And when you can read a book like that and an idea goes line by line, it may be different lengths of the lines, but
Mhm.
line by line, it makes sense and it's easy to read and easy to comprehend. And that's what
Yep.
we have in the RCE. You
Yep.
need to find a copy of the RCE.
There's lots of good book history. That's
Yeah.
one of the
Oh,
things
yeah.
about being a book geek.
Thank you for your presentation. It's
Well,
very
thank you for
informative
listening.
and I really enjoyed it.
Good. Val?
Yeah, I'm sort of interested in the rhetorical function of structural properties of a text. So, like when the Book of Mormon was translated, the language it used was archaic already, but it had kind of the authority of
Exactly.
King James language. And you mentioned that from the get-go, the King James had been in dual columns. So I'm wondering why, when the Book of Mormon was printed, they didn't choose to replicate not just the language, which could be inspired by God, so the way most of I think people here would see it, but also the sort of structural properties of a King James Bible, and maybe even including the versification. Was there just too much cost? Is it?
Oh, well, think about the context. Think about the context. And this is getting outside of my immediate expertise, but I can tell you, as somebody who deals with print, that you're dealing with a newspaper editor and a small town printer. You're not dealing with the big New York printers. And so, and they had to do it on the cheap. $3,000 was a huge amount of money. It was an enormous amount of money. And they were looking for 5,000 copies of a book at a time where a large print run for a typical edition was 500 to 700. So 5,000 copies of the book. It's no wonder that Grandin said, I'm not going to do that unless you give me some security. He can't afford to do this. And he ends up spending several $100s to buy his own set of types. So I think the quickest, the most defensible answer is they just put it onto type. They just put it on the page. That's all he cared about. I don't think Joseph looked at it as an alternative scripture. It was evidence that God's word had reconnected with humankind. The absolute form that it took was less important immediately. He just needed to get it out and into people's hands. I think that's probably the best answer that I can give. Is it authoritative? I don't know. You'd have to ask Joseph that. I'm not in that position at this point. Edward, one more time.
Okay, you made the comment just a moment ago that with regard to paragraphing and versification and so on, in response to Frank, you said, well, the Doctrine and Covenants has somewhat the same problem. I've discovered that the Doctrine and Covenant is also written in Hebraic form, and I'm in the process of preparing many of the revelations in a format that makes them not only easy to read, but much more exciting, because
Could be.
but you have to waste a lot of paper.
Yes, you do.
And
You may not know about it, but Rob Jensen from the Joseph Smith Papers Project and a couple of other folks are doing a new critical edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. Well, no, they're doing the Book of Mormon first. They're doing Book of Mormon. Well, they're going to do the Pearl of Great Price, the LDS version of the Pearl of Great Price. Pearl of Great Price, Doctrine and Covenants, and Book of Mormon in a form that you can follow all of the textual variation between the various editions.
mhm.
So they will do character by character. So punctuation, spelling, word order, those kinds of things. Now
Turns
it'll
out-
have its own structure because they're looking at textual movement through time. But that's one to keep your eyes out for. That's going to be an interesting project.
I've found several of those, several authors who have started doing the same kind of thing.
Mhm.
And one of the things that triggered my understanding about it was a private printing done by a man who wrote it for his own family. And after he died, his family had the book privately printed.
Who is
And,
that?
Oh,
That's one I've never seen.
Ed, it was Wade Brown.
Wade Brown, yes, Wade Brown, and included in the title, it was The Language of God.
Hmm.
The poetry of the Book of Mormon, or something like that.
Okay.
He was quite a biblical scholar. I think he had a PhD degree in Hebrew poetry, biblical poetry.
Okay.
And that really got me thinking, the language of God, because the work that Joseph Smith put out, the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, he obviously wasn't, he wasn't writing Hebrew poetry of his own intention.
Yep.
But the words he put together, is someone who is capable of reformatting them and showing the structures that are in there,
Mhm.
it's amazing. So
Yeah, it is.
so the language of God shines through, really, whatever you put on paper, but it's so much easier to understand when you display the characteristics that you can see. Anyway.
Okay. Anybody else? I guess, Paul, then we're done. They've had at me.
I can't imagine that because this group commonly has a lot more questions. You've gotten good quality, but
Yeah.
we clearly have not exhausted the interest. I have a number of people that I haven't heard from yet whose grades commonly are emphasized by their good questions. And so I would say, let's be patient just for a moment.
Sure.
Can I interrupt a second? Here is the actual book. It's called The God-Inspired Language of the Book of Mormon by Wade Brown.
Okay.
And he put every biblical poetic structure in the book. I mean, he has Kaya. The book is amazing. Unfortunately, if you try to buy a copy on Amazon, you can get it anywhere from $20 to $20,000
Hmm.
because there's not very many copies.
That sounds like Amazon, all right.
Yeah, but this was one of the most spectacular volumes of Book of Mormon printing that I saw.
Okay.
And there are other people who have them. There's one now for sale on Amazon called Poetic Parallelisms.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that there, as you mentioned, there are other people who are working on the critical text or
Yep.
understanding the Book of Mormon.
Yep, that is the case.
But I tell you, the decisions that made in the beginning about printing, I can see how difficult it must have been for them to. You say, well, this will add another 100 pages. Oh, he's not going to be.
Yep, won't do it. They tucked it as quick as closely as they could make it work.
Yeah.
Make it as inexpensive as possible. And still, the 1830 edition sold at roughly $1.25, $1.50 a piece. That's a lot of money, considering that at about the same time, Wilford Woodruff was getting 25 cents per cord of firewood stacked and cut and stacked.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I've cut a cord of firewood, and I know how much that is. Rick, you're up again.
Well, that's a little kinetic energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to go back to your example and diagram of the folding, the 8-way and the 16-way.
Mm-hmm.
There's still the same number of pages on that sheet.
There are.
It's just how you print it and then how you fold it that makes the big difference.
That's correct.
That's correct. Okay.
That's the only difference. Well, the difference between an octavo and a 16-mo when you're the printer is that you don't have to cut 50,000 sheets of paper in half. And that's why they did it. I'm sure that's why they did it. It was just one step that they could save money on in the print shop.
So if you fold it the 16-mo way, you can stitch it together and not have to cut it.
You not have to cut the press sheet. You still end up having to trim, trim the squares.
Yeah.
Trim
Okay.
it to size. Yes, but that's why.
Okay, so it reduced a step.
Yep.
But there was still 8 pages front and back printed.
Yep.
Before the folding happened.
Yep.
Okay. In modern printing, is it done the same type of 8-page setup and then folded?
Nope. No. Most modern printing these days is done. I'm gonna turn the light on. I can't even see myself. Just a second.
Can't see yourself. Oh,
The sun went down. Okay. In modern printing, you're usually running what's called an offset lithography. And those, if you look, those are the real high-speed presses. They go very, very quickly. So they don't do it. And when I worked in printing, we did the high-end textbooks, and those are usually printed in 32-page signatures rather than 8-page, because they're bigger machines. They're just absolutely enormous machines. Most printing that's done these days, if it's offset lithography, is 32 to 64-page signatures. However, a lot of the on-demand isn't even doing that. They're just simply printing sheets, folding them and trimming them, and then you collate them individually, kind of like a laser printer. But you can do that with now inkjet printing, high-speed inkjet printing that is absolutely indistinguishable from offset lithography. So we've hit another revolution in printing. I was working in publishing in the 1990s when we made the shift between film setters and what's called DTP, or disc to plate. And that completely upset everything. I mean, it was dramatic. It was traumatic too. I burned the last set of fold and trim blues in our print shop that ever was been done. And they've been doing it for 50 years. Mm-hmm. So, it's just one of those technological shifts, but no, we're way past 8 pages, unless you're still using a small letterpress printer. In that case, then yeah, that happens all the time.
It's called
So
a
an
new
offset-
paradigm.
Pardon?
It's called a new paradigm.
It's very much a new paradigm.
so
And
the
technology too.
So the offset printing prints multiple pages on one sheet and then folds it.
It doesn't even do it on a sheet. It's what's called web printing. They print it on a roll of paper. So it comes through and they'll print both sides at the same time.
Well, that's interesting, but they still have to fold it and fold it down into the book size.
Eventually, yeah, it goes through. Well, it depends on the machine you're running. If you're running a great big Heidelberg, then it'll literally put a roll of paper in one side and bound books out the other side. It's stunningly remarkable. But
It's
those
like
printing presses, they'll run 24 hours a day, 363 days a year. They have 2 down days for operation, but
and the other one,
it's phenomenal.
yeah, the other one you were talking about was printing single pages and collating them. and then binding them. And you said that was
Yeah.
pretty fast too. Like, I guess single books are, if you're not going to print a whole lot of books, that would be the way to go.
Yep.
Okay,
That's what on-demand printing is basically doing. these days.
on demand. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You bet. Bill Shepard's got his hand up. Let me give you a crack at it, and then I'll get to these other folks with their hands up too.
I was curious, I have a 1905 Northern States mission, mission and so forth. When the 20 comes out, who's the driving force with editing that or printing the 20?
1905 printing is probably the 1905 Northern States mission printing is probably done by Hillis and Etten. If you go to the very back page, it'll probably give you the printer's mark in the back there. That's Hillis and Etten out of Chicago. The 1920 edition of the Book of Mormon is commissioned formally on March 18th, 1920. The first copies are delivered to James Talmadge, who's basically the project manager, on December 18th, 1920, 9 months to the day. And I tell you, get the book and read it if you're really seriously interested, because it's a fascinating story. They do all of that in record time. But there are 6 members of the Quorum of the 12 who sit down and go through page by page, verse by verse, and do some textual comparisons and a number of other things. And then they have to get through, and that's between March and about May of 1920. And then book production happens between July and December. They do all the design work, all the everything printing, and then it goes to the bindery. And they bind those things and start delivering them over Christmas of 1920. Who's involved? It's commissioned by the First Presidency. It's worked on by 6 of the 12 apostles, and every single change that they do goes back to the First Presidency for approval. Everything. Okay, Val, your hand up again.
Yeah, I'm interested in a little bit in the economics of the production process. So one issue is, you mentioned that they were trying to save paper, keep the costs down. And I'm wondering if you have any idea what the constant dollar cost of that edition would be. Like if it were being sold today, what would the price on it be? Related issues are, was that were they producing, by doing that in-house, did they actually produce the book as cheap, at the cheapest level, or could they have contracted with an external body and got it produced more cheaply, presumably at the cost of the kind of editorial control you were just describing with the apostles and so forth? What were the trade-offs between the economics, what was the cost approximately, those kinds of issues?
I can tell you exactly, because I actually have the documentation on that. The book has the actual cost of the well, I didn't put that one in there. I can tell you the cost if you're really interested. It was about $12,000 to produce the type for the edition. They made 2 sets of plates, and that's one reason why the book is later being published in both Independence and in Salt Lake City from the same setting of type. And there's all kinds of complications that end up with that, and that's part of the fun of the book. The First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 get together and they formally set the cost, the retail costs that Deseret Book Company can charge for each of the editions of the book. And they specifically note, Talmadge specifically notes in his journal, that they kept the price low for the missionary edition, which is like 30 cents, it's 35 cents, maybe 50 cents retail cost, because they were specifically not going to make money on the Book of Mormon. Now the church didn't make money, Deseret Book Company made money, as they were the retailers and they handled the sale of the book. but the church specifically kept prices low so that people would be able to buy the book. So for instance, the full leather edition of the Book of Mormon that was printed in 1920 and distributed in 1921, basically. That one sold for $4 a volume. That's comparable to about a $50 book these days, which is about what you pay for scriptures now. So they're, as far as constant dollar cost, it's pretty close. It's not absolute, but it's pretty darn close. Paul, you had your hand up?
Yes, you give me a whole new appreciation for some of my family members. My grandmother and her brother were both in the printing business. Her brother as a printer and grandmother as a proofreader.
Mhm.
She worked for the Herald Publishing until they forced her to retire at age 65. And then she went across the street and signed on with the Independence Examiner and worked for 40 years.
Yeah.
And so to see those two people whose careers spanned most of the century, ending of grandmother died shortly after her retirement at age 105,
Wow.
2005.
Wow.
So to appreciate the changes that you're talking about in that industry that these people had to adjust to
Mhm.
gives me a whole new appreciation for what they went through. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. And just for context, the New York Times did not give up, was printing on hot metal type every single day until May 10th, 1978. And then they completely changed. They went from that to film setting literally overnight, and dumped all of their page makeup and their traditional hot metal type. Yeah,
Wow.
it's a remarkable story. There are very few industries that change. Automobile industry didn't change nearly as much as printing did. When you look at fundamental shifts in technology, we still do the same things. We add computers to cars and do a few other things. But printing changed 3 times in the 20th century.
Yeah.
As a kid, I got to go into the Herald Publishing, and here were these noisy machines clacking away, and I grew up on a farm, so I could handle the noisy machines, but it was just amazing to me. And then after the computer revolution, to see how significantly that changed things, and then here you're talking about the shift again in the early 2000s. I'm astounded, amazed.
Yeah. Well, there's actually, I just reviewed this book. This is a fascinating story of the shift in technology with the invention of the digital book and the distribution of the digital book and what it did to the major publishers. It's fantastic. It's a really good book. It's a British scholar studying American book industry, and it's really something.
Neat. Well, you give me hopeful prospects. Maybe I can get some things published after all.
Oh, yeah. Anybody else? Frank again?
Yeah. We just had a few books published or printed up.
Mhm.
We needed 10 books that were going to be used for proofing, and then I needed another 10 to get some more for local people here. And it's a large book, but it cost, we had to buy 10 of them, and they were $36.50 a piece.
That's pretty good.
I thought they had once you had the typeset and everything, or wouldn't be type, it would be what's on the hard drive. But once that was set up, I thought they could publish a single copy of a book for like $10, $15. What happened?
Well,
What's the difference there?
It's
we
very
had to
simple.
send this out to Indiana to get that done. They did there because they guaranteed it would be out the next day.
Yeah.
That was for the group of books that went to Africa, but the ones that we did here, why was that so much? And why did we have to order 10 of them instead of just ordering a couple of them?
Because people can charge that much and you'll pay it.
And get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, come on, folks, it's a business, right? Scriptures may not be a business, but by golly, anything else is. No, really and seriously, you can do it, but there's still cost involved. I did a transcription of my second great grandfather's diaries just because I've always wanted to do it. And I can get those down to 15 or 20 bucks a piece. But when you're dealing, but those are large companies. That's Ingram Spark, run by Ingram. And they do single and double copies. And if you're going to buy one copy, yeah, then it's going to cost you 55 bucks or 75 bucks or however much you do once you get it in. But when you're dealing with a smaller organization, it's going to cost them simply overhead. And they make the standard retail on a book is about 40% above the cost of production and manufacturing, editorial manufacturing and production together. So they look at it as a profit margin.
So do you have a list of companies that one might look to try to get
I work with
things
Ingram
published
Spark.
properly?
Yeah, Ingram Spark. In fact, you can go to ingramspark.com, I think is you can find it.
Where are
And
they
it'll cost
located?
you a little bit to upload your files. But by golly, they sure do nice work. I love on-demand publishing has exploded the number of books because I can do 10 copies and that's it. And nobody cares.
Where are they located?
All over the world, literally. They got their start in Nashville, Tennessee, as a book jobber for libraries. And they got into the on-demand printing business because they were supplying libraries. And now you can buy stuff off Amazon, which I don't like to do. I like to buy it directly from, Amazon takes its pound of flesh, pound and a half of flesh, as a matter of fact, 2 pounds if they can get it. But Ingram Spark, I love it. It's a good way to do it. They make really, another one you could work with is called blurb.com, but that one's aimed more at photography books. But boy, they do some remarkably good work.
Blurb.com.
Blurb.com, and they're based out of New York. And it doesn't do real well with text, just so you know.
So it's mainly for
It's
graphic
mainly for images,
image pictures and stuff like that. Yeah.
magazine type of things. Rick, your hand up again.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was wanting to see if Val would look at a question I asked him in the chat.
Oh, I haven't even looked at chat. I hope nobody says anything intelligent down there.
Yeah, happy
Well,
to do that.
Deb usually catches us up on the chat. So that's the only thing I had.
Okay.
Well, we are past 9:30 and it's opportune, I think, to sing us out. I thank you, Richard, for the remarkable presentation. What a wealth of information you have compiled, typical of the librarian. You really have demonstrated the resourcefulness that I've come to be fond of from librarians, and we look forward to having you back on
Good.
the month.
All right.
So Rena doesn't feel up to singing, so you get to hear me tonight. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord keep you. May the Lord lift up his face to shine on you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, folks.
If you want to stick around and chat a bit, we still can.